Good morning, everybody. Are there any opening remarks? This is the Planning and Zoning Board meeting of March 14th, 2022. And do I hear a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting?
I make a motion to accept the minutes of the February 14th.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? This is a quasi-judicial hearing. Sign variance application ZV 1202-1031, Holiday Inn Express, 3301 South Atlantic Avenue.
Good morning, Madam Chair, board members. For the record, my name is Stuart Cruz, the planner with the City of Dayton Beach Shores. Just I guess a formality. Attorney Olson, would you like to swear me and anyone else in?
Yes, thank you. If anyone's going to provide factual testimony in this matter, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth during the contents of this hearing?
I do. Thank you. So as Sherry, the city clerk, just mentioned, and I believe you did as well, Madam Chair, this is a continued quasi-judicial hearing from last month, February the 14th, ZB 12021-031. And the subject property is at 3301 South Atlantic Avenue. The owner applicant is Holiday Inn Express DBS Hospitality LLC. And Ray Webb, the from Kenco Signs, is here to represent them as well as someone from the franchise, I believe. So real quickly, because I know that there's maybe one or two board members who weren't here at the last meeting, I'll just go over it real quickly in terms of the property characteristics. The property is about 1.13 acres. The property is zone T-RMF-1 district, which is our dual zoning district for multifamily residential and for hotel and motel use. The property has a future land use of high intensity, and the current land use is a 100-unit hotel. So not to get too much into the background, but to essentially just get to the matter, which is that the variance request is to allow a monument sign of 12.5 feet in height and a 10-foot wide sign in lieu of the required 10-foot height and 8-foot width required respectively pursuant to section 6-8.6.1 of the Land Development Code. So basically, in this particular zoning district, the maximum height that is allowed for a monument sign is 10 feet high. The applicant is applying for a variance that would allow him to have a 12.5 feet high sign. So basically, it's a difference of 2.5 feet. And in addition, in this zoning district, the maximum width of the sign is 8 feet wide, and the applicant is applying for a 10 feet wide sign in lieu of the required 8 feet. So a difference of 2 feet there. And both of those differences add up to 25%, which is the maximum allowed under the city's land development code in terms of the variances in which the board can actually authorize these variances. So all the due public hearing requirements have been met. Staff has reviewed this. Real quickly, again, it's about a mile down the road from the city, from where we are right now. This is an aerial view of the site. You can see to the north is Larry Fenori Park, and to the bottom, or to the south is the Beachside Motel. This is a street view of the property. This is a street view of the sign. And the sign, I believe, is about 15 or 16 feet in height right now. And these pictures were actually provided by the applicant, Kenco Signs. As I mentioned earlier, this is a dual zoning district. And with the dual zoning district, as I mentioned earlier, the maximum height is 10 feet, and the maximum width is 8 feet. And you can see the differences to the bottom. I'm just going to go through this real quick because we spoke about this mostly last time. And this is a rendering of what is being proposed, a 10-foot wide sign and a 12.5-foot high sign. So in terms of the authorization criteria, the board, pursuant to the powers within section 6-10.1.4 of the code, may grant variances where there's a determination of substantial hardship made by the board. And so the code outlines three criteria, but only one of those criteria actually have to be met. You know, when you look at the code, there is an or after each criteria, and so not all three criteria have to be met, only one. But as I mentioned at the last board meeting, none of these criteria have been fully met in staff's opinion. And the first one is that exceptional narrowness, shallowness, or shape of the premises on which the sign is located. So that is supposed to be a substantial or a unique circumstance. And so staff did an analysis of the area. As you may recall, we looked at all the properties 1,100 feet north and 1,100 feet south of the property in the same zoning district. And all that we could determine in terms of any sense of uniqueness was that the depth of the property is actually 45 feet shorter than most of the other properties within that same distance. So that is the only unique criteria, or characteristic that staff was able to determine. In terms of the frontage, in terms of the size of the property, all these other things, they were more or less the same. So there's also no justification made for the wider sign, at least in the application, but I believe the applicant will speak to that as well. So in terms of the natural features of the property, in terms of the topography or physical features on the property, staff couldn't identify anything. So in other words, it wasn't a rolling type property. There wasn't any kind of environmental or natural feature that made this particular property unique. And then in terms of exceptional conditions or features of the existing built environment uniquely affecting the premises in which the sign is located, again, staff could not identify anything that was built on the property, and of course, built environment means a physical improvement. Staff could not staff could not identify anything that was unique on the property that would, justify the variance in terms of establishing a substantial hardship. And so this is the summary criteria that I showed last time. I did tweak it a little bit, but essentially it reflects the analysis that you saw, which basically says that two of the criteria, the last two were not met. The first one is partially met in staff's opinion. And so the meeting was continued from from February 14th, and it seemed as if there may have been additional information that could be brought to the board in terms of consideration for this variance. One of them was a letter from the franchisee, and you see that in your staff report. And then another one was the actual manual that Holiday Inn Express utilizes to construct or to build exterior signage. And so this is just a screenshot of the letter, and you all have seen it, but essentially I'm going to read it real quick. And it says, Holiday Inn Express has certain sign standards, and distorting the proportion of the sign outside of the Holiday Inn Express standards will risk the possibility of losing our franchise by not meeting their sign standard requirements. We have already reduced the size of the sign, but it cannot be reduced further without infringing on their requirements. We appreciate your understanding in this matter. Sincerely, Samir Naran, who is the CEO of the company that owns the property. So that's a letter from the franchisee. However, when you take a look at the actual manual, one of the first things I noticed was that under freestanding sign requirements, the minimum height requirements, as you can see, it's circled right there for a pylon sign. And just so you know, this is not a pylon sign, this is a monument sign. So I'll just skip over the pylon sign. The pylon sign is basically kind of like a pole sign or one of the taller signs. So in terms of monument sign, it says it right there, 6 feet. That's on page 5 in the manual. So what it's saying is that you can have a lower sign, but a minimum of 6 feet in height. And I believe the applicant will speak, representatives will speak to this, because I actually gave Mr. Ray Webb a call over the week, last week. I think it was Thursday or Friday, and essentially I was saying, we got this letter, but the actual manual is saying something else, and I couldn't find anything in the manual that kind of backed up what the letter was saying. So I'll let them speak to that. I may have missed it, but I'll let them speak to that. And so because of that, because of staff's inability to find anything in the manual that would contravene the minimum 6 foot requirement, or not contravene it, but that would actually allow them to not have a 6 foot high sign, and instead would require them to keep that 10 foot high sign. Staff's recommendation is unchanged. I do want to mention that staff, has looked at the site. There is a distance between the edge, the westerly edge of the sign, and the property line, and it's about 10 feet more or less. So staff did use this, application on the property appraiser's website that measures distance. It's not exactly 100%, but it's relatively close. But the point that staff is trying to make here is that there is a possibility, but obviously it's a financial one. It's a financial consideration that the property owner would have to make. So just so you can see, again, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the mouse there. So the sign is basically located in this area here, and it is surrounded by 4 parking spaces, as you saw in your staff report and in some of the exhibits that I passed on earlier. But the point that staff is trying to make is that from the westerly edge or lead of the sign to the property line, there's about 10 feet where theoretically, the sign could be placed closer to the property line. There is a 2-foot setback that the city requires, but again, there's still enough area. You still have more or less 8 feet where the sign could be relocated, but that's a decision that the property owner would have to consider in terms of addressing this, because I believe the property owner wants to utilize the existing foundation as there, and the planter that's there. Obviously, if you remove the sign, you have to create a new, or really put the sign closer to the road. You have to build and install new foundation and new, components of the sign that will be much more costly. So I believe that may have something to do with the decision, to try to utilize that area, that isn't entirely the best location for the sign. So if there's any questions for staff, I'll be happy to take those. And if not, I'm sure the applicant would love to, share their side of the story. Any questions?
I got a question, sir.
Yes.
How many Daytona Beach Shores businesses have requested variances for signage since this went into effect?
So this is the first. To my recollection, I know that we have one pending in the office right now.
So everybody else has sort of capitulated to what we want.
They've either done it or just not removed their sign as yet, and we can talk about that later. But of all the sign permit applications that we've gotten, I believe this is the first one. And like I mentioned, there's another one in the office that is pending.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions for staff?
Thank you. Nice report. You did a great report last time, too.
Thank you.
Does the applicant want to speak?
Yeah, you can leave a picture. Good morning, Raymond Webb, Kenco Signs. How are you today? With me is Director.
Domine Tax, VP of Operations for Premier Resorts.
The aspect of this, as we've discussed last month, is the fact that we, in fact, have to be visible according to Holiday Inn standards. When you take and reduce the height of a sign, reduce the square footage of a sign, you also reduce the overall impact of the sign. And if you noticed in that picture that he had up earlier, there is a runoff spillway right there where if in fact if that wasn't there, we could go further towards the road, which in fact would help our position. But because that is there, I don't know that we can even go towards the road further. I don't know what the pipe size is. DOT didn't get back to me. I was trying to find out that information. So, given that situation, we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard spot. If we change the sign to what your new code requires, then we are basically violating the Holiday Inn Express terms, based on the fact that if in fact we go too small and it's not visible, there are tables of signage that we have illustrated. And they do go down to 6 feet, but that 6-foot sign is a directional. It's not a monument sign that could be entertained in this. Directional, interaction type thing. Bottom line is, if we don't get this, the challenge would be, how do we keep our franchise? And how do we continue to do business when when you park a vehicle in front of it at the overall height of 10 feet, it disappears. Basically disappears because of where it has to go. Yes, we are trying to keep it in that planter area. That planter area was made for it expressly. And if in fact we try and go forward of that, we're into that DOT runoff spillway.
Good morning. I also wanted to add that we're already going down in size because of the new ordinance. So we were asking to not go down 2 sizes, but go down 1 size, again, to keep the visibility of the sign for the traffic that comes north and southbound on A1A, which is extremely important for the business.
Thank you.
Questions?
I don't have any questions. Anybody have any questions? Stuart, I do have a question for you.
Sorry.
This isn't a new ordinance. This ordinance has been in effect for a while, right?
Yes, the ordinance has been in effect since 2012.
That's right, okay. And for the applicant, you could put on those parking spaces, you could put compact cars. You could mark those spaces that they're for compact cars only, which would not interfere with the sign, correct? Little compact cars you can put out there.
Well, you
Like they do
can,
at my place.
you can ask for that, yes. Whether they do it or not is like putting a handicap sign up. Are they always handicap people parking there? No. Bottom line is, they do what they want, especially in a hotel that large. If they see an empty spot, they're gonna pull into it. So I don't think that that would restrain them as much as you might think.
Thank you. Do I hear a motion?
I got some.
Oh, you got some more questions? Okay.
I went through town since the last meeting, and I counted 27 businesses who have the same issue with the monument sign possibly obscuring parking spaces. And none of them, according to Stuart, has complained about it. I also went up to Holiday Inn inside of the Ormond Beach, or Daytona Beach, and there's a small 6-foot sign. It's not a directional sign, but it's sitting there quite open next to parking spaces, and it's probably covered when it's full, but it's not. My point is, we've got all these businesses who've capitulated to our monument sign, and whether it covers parking spaces or not. And I just don't think it would be fair to them if we change the rules in the middle of crossing the stream here. Okay?
My concern is that there's no proof that they're gonna lose the franchise or anything happens to the franchise.
There's not a letter from Atlanta saying, if you don't do this, we're gonna pull your franchise. Holiday Inn won't pull a franchise if they're making money off of it.
Right.
Okay?
Exactly.
Just saying.
As much as we care, we have to consider every
To the other people.
point. Any more discussion? Do I hear a motion? Approve?
Chair, I'd like to just make a comment. After those comments by the board, I'd like to remind the board that for this particular matter, the board ought to focus, or the concern of the discussion ought to focus on the specific property at issue. I understand the comments relating to the other businesses around, but for approval or denial of a variance, it ought to be based on those criteria set out as staff pointed out. So the individual characteristics of the property itself, which there was a lot of discussion about. But just after hearing some of the discussion of other properties around town, it's well taken, but the real discussion ought to center on the actual property itself at issue here.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So if I hear no motion to approve, Garrett? If I hear no motion to approve,
I would, if it's the chair's pleasure to ask if there's a motion either way to approve or to deny.
okay. Is there a motion either way to approve or deny this ordinance?
I move to deny variance ZB 12021-031 on the basis it does not comply with our current regulations.
Is there a second?
Second.
Vote, please, Sherry.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Deloche?
Yes.
Mr. Lilly?
Yes.
Ms. Tornatori?
Yes.
Ms. Groot?
Yes.
Mr. Horian?
Yes.
Thank you. Moving right along, the next issue is ordinance 2022-08, rezoning application RZ 1202-1040, Colby and Jennifer Caldwell, 6 Carter Terrace, annexed property.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Board members, again, this is Stuart Cruz, City Planner with the City of Daytona Beach Shores. This is a quasi-judicial hearing. As you know, Madam Chair, every time a property is annexed into the City of Daytona Beach Shores, the city is obliged, if it wants to enforce its land development regulations and comprehensive plan, to rezone the property and to also change the future land use for that property from county to city. And so this is essentially, the next 4 items that you see are essentially part of that process that's required under state law. So this particular property is 6 Carter Terrace. The applicant owner is Colby and Jennifer Caldwell. The property size is 0.22 of an acre. The current zoning for the property is R9, which is the county's urban single-family residential district, and the proposed zoning is, or the similar zoning, which is the proposed zoning, is RSF-2, which is essentially the same name, urban single-family residential detached district for Daytona Beach Shores. The current entitlement is for 1 single-family residence on the property, and the proposed entitlement will be the same. And that's the reason why the impact summary analysis that you see in your staff report, the summary essentially is no change. There's going to be absolutely no change with the rezoning. It's just essentially a change in the map that allows the city to go ahead and enforce its land development regulations. So this is the current location of the property. It's right behind Red Lobster Plaza off Carter Terrace, obviously, and this is probably a better view. You can see Red Lobster to the east, South Atlantic Avenue to the east of Red Lobster Plaza, and to the west is the 6 Carter Terrace property. This is a street view of the property. And as I mentioned, currently the zoning for this property, because it was a recently annexed property that we just annexed in January of this year, I believe, late January of this year, it's an R9 county zoning. And so essentially what would happen if this ordinance were to be adopted is that the color on the map would now change to the RSF-2, and the city would now be able to enforce land development regulations, or if the property owner wanted to rebuild, they would have to rebuild in conformity with the city's regulations and not the county's regulations. So upon mentioning that, staff is recommending approval. As I mentioned earlier, and you see staff report, there's no change in terms of the analysis, in terms of the actual entitlement or the specific standards that staff that you see in your regulations for RSF-2. So staff is recommending approval of this. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thank you, Stuart. Do you have any questions? Do I hear a motion?
I move to recommend approval of ordinance 2022-08 as presented.
Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Do you need a vote, Sherry?
We do need a vote. Ms. Groot?
Yes.
Ms. Tornatori?
Yes.
Mr. Lilly?
Yes.
Mr. Horian?
Yes.
Mr. Deloche?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Stuart.
So I'll stay here for a little bit.
This is ordinance 2022-09, rezoning application for RZ 1202-1043, Larry and Barbara Pollock, 3102 Liberty Street, annexed property.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. So this particular ordinance, just like the one previously, is a rezoning ordinance, but for this property, it's at 3102 Liberty Street, which is not too far from here. It's actually right around the corner off Van Avenue, and I'll share that in a minute. The property owner applicant is Larry and Barbara Pollock. The property is a little bit larger. It's closer to 0.8 of an acre. The zoning, however, is the same, R9, which is the general zoning for Volusia County properties in this vicinity. The proposed zoning is RSF-2, which is the urban single-family residential detached district. And the current entitlement is for 1 single-family residence. And I'm just pointing this out to you again because when we look at the future land use map entitlement, you'll see that it's a little bit different, and I'll explain the reason for that. So as I mentioned, the property is right around the corner. Here is public safety, and you just take a right-hand turn if you're heading southbound on Van Avenue, and this is the property. My mouse isn't working. As you can see, it's a vacant property. It's at the corner of Liberty, Van, and Brookfair Crescent. This is a street view of the property. And similar to the previous application, this particular application, there is exactly no change in terms of the entitlement that would be gained. Again, this is just a process that we have to go through if we want to be able to enforce our land development regulations. And whenever, I don't know if any of you have visited the property, but there was some dirt moving around on the property. And eventually, the property owner is going to submit building permits to the city. And if the city wants to not only apply, well, not necessarily the building permits, but to apply its land development regulations in terms of setbacks and in terms of building height and things like that, this is a process that we have to go through. So staff is recommending approval. Oh, the map. The same thing like the other one. Currently, the R9 zoning on the map, or color, if you want to call it that, is there. And if this ordinance is passed, it will change to match the city zoning in the area, which is essentially the same, more or less, as the county's zoning. And staff is recommending approval.
Any discussion? Do I hear a vote?
I move to recommend approval of ordinance 2022-09 as presented.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Vote please, Sherry.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. DeLonge?
Yes.
Ms. Groot?
Yes.
Ms. Tornatore?
Yes.
Mr. Lilly?
Yes.
Mr. Horn?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the next are action items on the same properties, I think.
Yes.
Ordinance 2022-06, future land use map amendments, CPA 1202-1041, Colby and Jennifer Caldwell, 6 Carter Terrace, annex property. Just a formality, right?
Yes. And so typically, whenever we go through the process, the comprehensive plan map amendment, future land use map amendment would come first, but because we're doing quasi-judicial hearing at the top of the agenda, we decided to go ahead and put them together, so we weren't jumping back and forth. But whenever you look at the council agenda, you're going to see these ordinances come up first, the comprehensive plan and future land use map amendments come up first. And again, this is a recently annexed property, 6 Carter Terrace. This is a statute that I was referring to earlier. It's statute 171.062 of the Florida statutes, which basically says, if an annexed property was a subject of county land use plan or county zoning or subdivision regulations, these regulations will remain in full effect until the municipality adopts a comprehensive plan amendment that includes the annexed area. And from a zoning standpoint, the city can't really enforce zoning unless there's a compatible and an overarching comprehensive plan future land use classification assigned to it. And so this is what this particular ordinance is doing. We're assigning the future land use classification to the property. And so I won't go over the details, but essentially the entitlement remains the same for single family. No change, and all that's outlined in your staff report. Again, this is where the property is located, just west of Red Lobster Plaza of Carter Terrace, which connects to South Peninsula Drive. Street view of the property. And so now this is the future land use map. So what you can see is that it has the county future land use, color or designation there, and they look really similar, believe it or not. But there was a change right there in the map. So if this ordinance is adopted, this is what the color will look like on the map. And so staff is recommending approval of this particular ordinance. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to take those.
Thank you, Stuart. Any questions? Do I hear a vote?
Oh, I move to recommend approval of ordinance 2022-07 as presented. No? 06.
06, the first.
Okay.
Sorry, I flipped it on you.
Yeah.
No, that's okay, it's okay. I move to recommend approval of ordinance 2022-06 as presented.
Second.
Vote please, Sherry.
Ms. Groot?
Yes.
Mr. DeLonge?
Yes.
Mr. Horian?
Yes.
Ms. Tornatore?
Yes.
Mr. Lilly?
Sure.
So If we're moving on to 2207?
2022-07, future land use map amendment, CPA 1202-1044, Larry and Barbara Pollock, 3102 Liberty Street, the next property.
Correct, and this is the same thing as the previous ordinance, and this is a statute again that I, always mentioned. So the difference with this property is that you'll see the entitlements here. The current entitlement on the county is for 3 single-family residences, and with the city, the proposed future land use would be 3 single-family residences as well. Now, you might ask why this is different from the other ones, and the reason for that is because of the size. Because the classification density range is from 0 to 4 units per acre. So when you do the math, when you apply the 0.79 times 4 units per acre, you get 3 units. So currently, they're entitled to build 3 single-family units on that property, and the proposed change that we would make would match exactly that, and that's the reason why there's no change in terms of the impact summary that you see in your staff report. So basically, it's a like for like. So again, this is the property. Just go through this real quick. This is what the map looks like currently. And you can see the lines, they actually switch. I don't know if you guys have noticed that. Yeah, so before the lines were going one way, and now it goes the other way to the cities. And so staff is recommending approval of this.
I hear a motion to approve, or is there any discussion?
I move to recommend approval of the ordinance 2022-07 as presented.
Excuse me, one moment. Did you have a question?
If they build 3 different homes on there, do they have to divide the property in 3 different parcels?
Yes, but they would also have to change the zoning. So remember that they're not only limited or regulated by the zoning, they're also regulated by the comp plan future land use. So they're entitled under the comp plan to have up to 3 units, but the zoning also holds or restricts them to just 1 unit. So if they wanted to subdivide if they wanted to build more than 3 on that property, they wouldn't be able to under the current zoning unless they actually split those into 3. And then they would be entitled to 1 for each of those 3 resulting lots.
Thanks, Stuart.
Good point.
Good point. Again, Chuck, do you want to make a motion?
I move to recommend approval of ordinance 2022-07 as presented.
Second.
Vote please, Sherry.
Mr. Horian?
Yes.
Ms. Gerb?
Yes.
Ms. Tortori?
Yes.
Mr. Delange?
Yes.
Mr. Lilly?
Next on the agenda is ordinance 2022-10, Townhome Minimum Development Area Amendment.
So this one is a little bit different, board members. Ordinance 2022-110, if adopted by the city, would essentially amend the minimum development area required per unit for a townhome in the RMF-2 district. And this is an administrative amendment. And what this means essentially is that staff is the one who's proposing this. And as you'll see, the reason why staff is proposing this is because we actually have a site plan being processed right now, and in doing the analysis, staff observed that there's a kind of for lack of a better term, a glitch or something that was inconsistent or didn't make sense in our regulations. So what we noticed is that the minimum area that's required for each townhome unit in this district is the same minimum area that's required for a townhome unit in the lower density or more restrictive zoning district, which is RMF-3. So essentially in the RMF-2 district, there is a density allowance or range of 12.1 units per acre up to 35 units per acre. So if you were to do the math on that, because the actual requirement per unit for a townhome in this district is 3,630 square feet. So if you did the math, you divided 3,630 into 43,560, which is basically the square footage of an acre, you'll notice that only 12 townhome units are allowed. Well, that same divider, essentially, is that what it's called, the one in the bottom? Numerator?
Numerator.
Numerator is on top?
Numerator, denominator.
Denominator, yes. When the same denominator is present in the RMF-3 district, which only allows up to 12 units per acre. So it doesn't make sense, and I'll show you an illustration real quickly to let you better understand it. But basically, when you do the math, both districts only allow 12 townhome units per acre. you know, and generally whenever you do planning and you craft these regulations, the higher intensity one, if you want to call it that, would allow more of those units. You know, they wouldn't match with the lower or the more restrictive zoning district. And again, I'll show you an illustration real quick if I'm kind of confusing you right now. But the other reason why we're doing this is because the Daytona Beach Shores strategic plan, which was adopted, I want to say about 3 years ago, has an objective A2, which basically says that the city should or shall remove land development regulations that are obstacles to desired redevelopment and to enable or promote desired development. So I think most people would agree in Daytona Beach Shores that townhome development, especially the neighbors, would prefer those in terms of development versus condos on the west side of South Atlantic Avenue, for example. So the RMF-2 district is on the west side of South Atlantic Avenue and not on the east side. So as I mentioned earlier, the RMF-2 district, when you look on the townhome development, and remember RMF-2 is medium density residential, you'll see the denominator there in terms of the minimum lot size required per unit is 3,630 square feet per dwelling unit. So basically whatever the area is for a particular site that wants to have townhome development, you divide this 3630 into that number, and that will give you basically the number of units that are permitted. But the problem, of course, is that the more restrictive or lesser dense townhome district, RMF-3, essentially has that same denominator, and so those two things should never match. So this is my attempt to make things simpler.
Okay.
Hopefully it works. So basically, on the left-hand side, you see RMF-2 district, and on the right-hand side, you see the RMF-3 low-density district. So the denominator is basically 3630 square feet per unit. So when you do the math on an acre parcel, you basically end up with the same result, 12 on this side and 12 on the left and 12 on the right, and that shouldn't be the case. So over here, you see the guys, the property owners in the RMF-3 district, they're able to fully maximize their density allowed, whereas on the left-hand side, which is the RMF-2 district, which is the subject of this amendment, they're not able to do that. And that is typically a no-no in planning.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
The townhomes that are being built now, how many units are there, and are they RF2
So the townhomes that are
being built in front
that are
of?
near
Did they,
completion, yeah, right
in this
next
too?
door. Yes, the Oceans 25. So the Oceans 25, they have a very peculiar situation. So they're actually zoned mixed use, MXD, which is our mixed use development district. So the reason why they're able to build townhomes is because the property owner entered into a development agreement with the city to allow townhomes with specific standards for that site. So it was kind of, in some jurisdictions you call it almost like a planned unit development, but basically it was a specially crafted agreement to allow that development to happen. So what we're doing here would not apply to that, and whatever's happening over there doesn't apply to this. It's a different formula, it's a different set of standards that were created and approved by the city council and by the property owner, because they both had to sign this land use contract to make that development happen. Does that make? Okay.
How many units are there?
So there were 25, I believe. Ocean's 25 units. So, so what would happen if this code amendment were to go through is that we've changed the denominator now. Instead of keeping it at 3630, which is currently the case, and currently the case in the RMF-3 district, we've reduced the denominator. So what happens now, instead of just having 12 units on the site, you could now, the developer would now be able to build 18 units on the site, and that's the mid-range between the 12 and the 35. The reason why we didn't go all the way up to the 35 units per acre is because townhomes are a horizontal form of development or construction versus vertical. With a condo, you can just stack. But and theoretically, you can go up to, depending on the site, you can go up to 7+ stories on an RMF-2 district. And I say 7+ because the building height restriction in the RMF-2 district is 6 to 5 feet. So depending on ceiling heights and depending on topography or whatever, you could get anywhere from 6 to 7 stories. So unfortunately, or I shouldn't say unfortunately, but with horizontal type development, meaning townhomes, you're constricted within the confines of your property limits or your boundaries. And so in order to have townhome developments have like a pool or other type of amenities, staff decided to let's go to the midpoint right now, which is consistent with other areas in Volusia County, so that we wouldn't have a site that's totally maxed out with townhome developments and there's no amenities for the people that are actually going to live there. So that's the reason why we came up with the midpoint, because that made sense from a planning standpoint, and it's also consistent with other townhome regulations within Volusia County. If you check Port Orange, Ormond Beach, some of the other jurisdictions around here, it's more or less the same.
How many properties would this affect?
So this would affect any property in RMF-2 district, and right now I believe we have about maybe 30 of them, but in terms of being able to be developed, I think there's only maybe about 2 or 3 that are vacant that could be developed, because the remaining 27 or so are actually built out already with other improvements. So if they do come around, it would be sometime in the future through a redevelopment process. So did this make sense? Do you guys have any questions on this? Okay. So with that, staff is recommending approval of this ordinance.
Is there a motion? You making a motion?
Go ahead, Mr. Lilly.
Go ahead. I don't have the numbers in front of me.
Okay. I move to recommend approval of ordinance 2022-10 as presented.
I have a second?
I'll second it.
Vote please, Sherry.
Ms. Tornatori?
Yes.
Ms. Group?
Yes.
Mr. Horian?
Yes.
Mr. Lilly?
Yes.
Mr. Deloche?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart.
Can I have a question for him?
Yeah.
It's open.
Yeah.
The property that's right on A1A that used to have that rental surf place that burned down,
Yes.
it's been vacant with the fence for a long time. What's the status of that?
Next month. I'm glad you asked. They have submitted a site plan application. So the delay, it's been almost 2 years, I believe, or maybe perhaps more, if I remember correctly. Part of the delay has been, my understanding, dealing with insurance companies. And also, so I'll leave it at that, but we have a site plan application that has been submitted. It's finally complete. And in terms of analyzing the site plan, staff has observed that the property owner wants to build back the exact same structure, more or less, that was there within the same footprint. And the reason why I'm being careful with my comments is because in the staff analysis, staff observed that when this building was built, in the 50s or so, we didn't have land development regulations. And so now we do, and so obviously there's some conflicts with the existing land development regulations. And so staff identified a number of variances that they would have to apply for, or they would essentially have to shrink the footprint and do some other things to make it meet the current code. So it is my understanding that they will be applying for variances, and that application will come before you next month. And that's the reason why I'm being careful with what I'm saying, because I don't want to prejudice the thought process.
Thank you, Stuart. I have a question.
Sure, and then I do have something to state as well.
Go ahead.
You want to go first? I can't remember on the agenda. Let's see. So let me just state real quickly that the city staff will be bringing forward an ordinance to extend the amortization period for the monument sign ordinance. So you may recall that the amortization, meaning the deadline, the period to meet the city's regulations. The city adopted the sign regulations, monument sign regulations in 2012, April of that year, and we gave everyone 10 years to essentially, meet the code. We even the city even established a grant program to kind of assist business owners to help them with that, because we know, times are hard. I mean, 2012, we were just kind of getting around the corner from the recession, and then from 2012 up to today, there was another mini recession or two, and then we had the storms, and then we had that thing called COVID, which has been impacting us for the last 2 years. And COVID not only impacted the health of human beings, but also the health of the local economy, regional economy, national universal economy, and not only that, but also the supply chain. So because of that reason, I have been getting some calls from different business owners saying that they're having issues in terms of meeting the deadline. Obviously they waited till, the last couple of years or the last minute or whatever have you. But, after careful consideration, staff will be proposing an amendment to extend that amortization period. I'm not going to mention that just right now because that ordinance is going to be coming before you, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that will be coming before you, next month.
Speaking of signs, I remember when this went into effect that I heard, I think, that some of the signs will be grandfathered in. Is that the case? And
So the ordinance in 2012 did have a provision for, I don't remember the exact term, but for 3 signs, 3 or 4 signs, because they held exceptional community value to the city. And those signs were essentially grandfathered in, as you mentioned. And those 3 signs were the Akotiki sign, the big tiki thing. Obviously, that has been a landmark in the shores for a while. The other one is the Sun Viking sign. And then the other one is the Oceans Master Homeowners Association out on Atlantic Avenue. So those were the only 3 that were and I think they have another one on South Peninsula that were grandfathered in. So did you hear something other than that? Because those are the only 3 that were grandfathered in 2012.
I heard that there were more than that, but
No.
that's fine.
No.
Is that going to affect anything we talked about today?
No. So basically what that would do, if this ordinance is passed, and I hate speaking about things that are in a conditional nature.
Keep going. No, you're fine.
Okay. Yeah, so if that ordinance comes before the board and goes before city council and is approved, all they will do is give an additional stay, if you will, or extension for them to get their sign into conformity. So instead of getting a letter from Gwen in code enforcement on April 10th of this year, whatever the new deadline is, they would have that additional time to essentially bring their form into conformity or apply for a variance if they have a substantial hardship, blah, blah, blah. If not, then they would be getting that letter, the day after from Gwen, whenever that new deadline is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it wouldn't impact. So and the city attorney mentioned earlier, what you're looking for when it comes to variances are the standards that are established in the code,
Gotcha.
and whether or not those standards are unique to that property itself.
Does the subsidy program go with the extension?
I'm sorry?
Does the subsidy program go with the extension?
We are talking about it, and actually the city council, and I actually forgot to mention this, the city council did approve for staff to bring something back to them in terms of a subsidy to kind of help those people who didn't get their signs done and were affected by COVID and whatever else impacted their delay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Was there any other questions?
I do have a question.
Yes.
What's going on with Treasure Island?
Treasure Island, you may recall that the development agreement was executed, I believe, in early February. Yeah, we had a special meeting on that. And they had 30 days thereafter to get their bids into us. They did get that into us. And then they had an additional 30 days to start demolition, or initiate demolition. And initiating demolition essentially means get a demo permit in, mobilizing equipment, and actually having things done on the site. And so we have received, we're not at that additional 30-day or 60-day period just yet. We're getting there in maybe a couple of weeks. But what I can tell you is that they have submitted their demolition permit. Unfortunately, with any permit application, sometimes if you have someone from out of town who's not familiar with the process, there are a few things that are missing, and we hope to have those things addressed before the end of this week. So we're making progress, baby steps, but we're making progress.
Lots of work for you, I know.
What about across the street from the Treasure Island, where that building has that wraparound black?
Yes, it's my understanding that is a subject of code enforcement.
'Cause that's been that way for a long time.
Yes, they've had some time to address it, and they've been, to my recollection, they've been working in code enforcement to get certain issues addressed. But yes, you're right, it has been there for a while.
I must say, listening to you today, the staff, and we know who the staff is, very busy.
Yes, the staff has been busy.
And you do a good job.
Do.
I'll share that with the staff.
Appreciate
Gary.
Thank you. Well, it's a team effort. I mean, seriously, I'm the one up here, but, Fred, Gwen, the guys in the building department, the city attorney's office, Sherry, I mean, it's a team effort. And of course, we get our guidance from management as well when it comes to larger policy issues.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any
Thank
other
you.
comments?
Thank you.
Board comments? Anything? No?
I forgot to mention, Angie as well, I would not be able to put the presentations up there. I can't see her back there. but-
She's over there hiding
Angie, I
somewhere.
want to have any presentation.
Thank you. Stand adjourned.
Thank you. We should have said, don't forget to change the clock.
Yeah.
I know, the clock is
Don't forget to change the clock.
Okay, I will climb up there.
Yeah, climb up there.
it. Let staff do it.
capable.
Yes, actually, I have a
Before they're ready.
city commission meeting had been held this afternoon. I'm hanging out here for a little bit.
Just watch you.
Yeah.
Line through?
I'm from the area. My parents live in Foreman. So I think I'm gonna go hang out at the.
Go get some breakfast.
Yeah. Exactly. Oh, I wish all my meetings were that easy.
Probably make it easy.